The Silent Night of Normandy. A sleep story from medieval history. Chapter 1. The Last Battle. It was not a grand battle. There were no cheering crowds, no painted banners fluttering in the wind, and no songs written after. The field outside the village of Saint-Lô was quiet that morning, damp from night rain, the mist still lingering over the tilled soil like a blanket. Sir Alaric de Fontaine, a knight of no great fame but solemn reputation, stood with his sword sheathed. His chainmail, dulled from many winters, clinked with each breath he took. Around him, others prepared in silence, men with rusted helms, farmers conscripted with pitchforks, and 3 squires who barely had whiskers on their cheeks. They weren't soldiers, they were shadows of a noble dream that had long since faded. Alaric hadn't spoken in 10 years. He wasn't born mute. His voice was once strong, enough to command in battle and sing at harvest feasts. But after the siege of Caen, something inside him had closed. A silence settled over him like snow, and it had never melted. They said it was grief. They said it was guilt. No one truly knew. When the skirmish began, it was brief and cruel. The Normans held their ground, but there was no glory in it, just loss. At the end of the day, Sir Alaric stood alone. His horse was wounded, the others slain, and the sun was beginning to set. He did not shout for help or curse the gods. Instead, he turned away from the bloodied earth and began walking. His sword remained in its sheath. He never drew it again. Chapter 2. The Road to Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive. Sir Alaric traveled slowly, his horse limping beside him, its breath rattling like an old bellows. He followed no road in particular, only the meandering ribbon of the river Dives. The land was gentle there, rolling hills, sleepy farms, and crooked chapels that leaned as though tired of standing upright. He found shelter in a burned barn outside the village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive. The owners were gone, fled perhaps, or buried. He swept aside ash and straw, gave water to his horse, and lit no fire. The silence comforted him. A monk from the local abbey, Father Benoit, noticed the strange man. He came often to the barn, bringing bread, warm milk, and sometimes apples. "You do not speak," the monk said once, gently, "but I sense your soul listens." Chapter 3. The Monastery of Saint Lucie. The monastery was a quiet one, nestled beside a stream that fed into the Dive. Its stones were pale and pitted with age, moss clinging to corners, and wildflowers blooming between the cracks. The bell tower tolled softly only at dawn, midday, and dusk. Alaric was given a cell with 1 window. It faced a field of barley that swayed like the sea when the wind came from the north. The walls were bare, the bed was straw, the silence was deep. He began tending the garden. The brothers didn't ask questions. They respected his quietness, and in time came to appreciate it. Alaric pruned the vines, harvested herbs, fed the chickens, and repaired tools without ever asking for thanks. But the silence was not empty. It was full of thoughts, of memories, and of the gentle ticking of time. Each day, a little softer than the last. Chapter 4. A Clock Without Hands. Spring came slowly in Normandy. Mist clung to the edges of the stream like an old shawl, and each dawn carried the scent of wet grass and thawing earth. At the monastery, the rhythms of the season were marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the behavior of birds, the first budding violets, and the warm hush of bees in the orchard. Sir Alaric rose with the sun. He ate with the brothers in silence, a meal of rye bread, boiled eggs, and cheese wrapped in leaves. Then, he would gather his tools and walk the stone path to the herb gardens. The mint and marjoram, thyme and rue, he tended them all with hands that once held swords, but they no longer shook. Brother Matthias, the young apothecary, watched him from time to time. At first, with caution, later, with awe. "His hands," Matthias whispered one day to Father Benoit. "They never tremble. Like the rain knows how to fall, and the leaves know how to turn, he knows how to touch things just so." Father Benoit nodded, thoughtful. "It is said those who lose their voice gain their listening. The night hears things most do not." And he did. Alaric could sense the weather changing in the weight of the wind. He could smell a sick lamb before it coughed. He noticed the color of the yolk told more about the hen's health than any chart. He could read the world like parchment. But his past, written in a language of blood and smoke, remained folded away. Chapter 5. The Letters of Brother Anselm. There was one thing in the monastery Alaric grew fond of, though he never said it aloud. Each evening, after vespers, the elderly Brother Anselm would take his candle, climb the creaking steps of the scriptorium, and write. He wrote letters. Not to anyone particularly. Some were addressed to saints, some to kings long dead, others, strangely, to the bees or to the wind itself. They were letters of reflection, filled with dreamy questions and sleepy observations. Thoughtful, "Dear moonlight, thank you for falling just right on the stone basin this evening." Gentle, "To the sparrow I fed last Tuesday, I hope your journey south is gentle." Observing, "To the night in the garden, who says nothing and yet says everything, I see you." Alaric read these letters when Anselm left them on the bench. At first, he wasn't sure if he was meant to, but when a letter was left addressed simply, "To whomever is listening," he understood. And so, Alaric began leaving replies. Short ones, scratched in charcoal, unsigned. Quiet thoughts like feathers on the page. Softly, "The moonlight is softer than war." Observing, "The sparrow returned this morning." Grateful, "Thank you for seeing me." They never spoke about it, but every evening the two men continued their silent correspondence. Like monks in a paper monastery, their friendship was built on parchment and breath, not sound. Chapter 6. The Chapel in the Orchard. Beyond the herb garden, at the edge of the monastery's lands, stood a small chapel, round, roofed in slate, and half overgrown with climbing roses. The brothers called it La Chapelle de Brume, the Chapel of Mists. No one had worshipped there in decades. It was too far from the main cloister, and slightly crooked from an earthquake long forgotten. But Alaric visited often. He cleared the path slowly, day by day. He repaired the sagging wooden door. He swept the floor, cleaned the moss from the stone altar, and fixed the cracked stained glass with shards of blue and green from the scriptorium's broken lamps. One morning, a bird followed him in, a small wren, brown and unassuming, with a missing feather from one wing. It became a habit. Alaric would sit in the chapel, eyes closed, and the bird would perch near the window, singing softly into the quiet. In time, others joined. A mouse who lived beneath the altar, a cat who refused to catch it, and the slow return of Ivy creeping in from the wall like a green, curious guest. He never prayed with words, but his stillness was a kind of prayer. Chapter 7. The Silence of Fireflies. By midsummer, the monastery grounds glowed with warmth. Cicadas buzzed in the tall grass, the stream sang louder, and fireflies began to drift like lazy stars between the trees each night. The monks often stood by the cloister wall at dusk, watching them rise, hands folded, smiles soft. It was during one of these evenings that a young novice, Brother Teo, asked Alaric a question. He wasn't supposed to. The brothers had agreed not to push him, but curiosity, like ivy, finds its way through stone. "Gentle sir," Teo asked gently, holding out a small cup of plum wine, "why do you not speak?" Alaric took the cup. He didn't answer. But then, very slowly, he raised one hand and pointed, first to the stars, then to the garden, and finally to the fireflies dancing just beyond the wall. Brother Teo looked confused, then thoughtful, then smiled. "I see. It's because you don't need to. The world already does." Alaric nodded once. The fireflies blinked, then vanished into the orchard. Chapter 8. The Visitor from the South. It was late summer when the rider came. A dusty bay horse trotted up the monastery's path just after lauds, when the dew still clung to every leaf, and the sky held the soft blush of dawn. The rider was wrapped in a faded green cloak, face half covered with a linen veil. A woman, rare among the cloister walls, rarer still on horseback. She asked for Father Benoit. The brothers gathered, murmuring, not in suspicion, but in wonder. Visitors were uncommon. Female ones, near non-existent. The woman dismounted with quiet grace. Her eyes were sharp but tired. She introduced herself only as Isabeau, saying she was a scholar from the south, come seeking the writings of a brother Anselm. Alaric, working by the wall with a basket of apples, looked up slowly. Something in her voice, measured, melancholic, caught his ear. Father Benoit welcomed her in, and a guest cell was prepared. She would stay 3 days, maybe 4. Chapter 9. The Scriptorium Dusts. Isabeau spent her hours in the scriptorium, poring over Brother Anselm's letters. She read silently, lips not moving, turning each parchment as if it were glass. The other brothers kept a respectful distance, but she noticed Alaric from the window, always tending something, vines, stones, the chapel. On the 3rd day, she found a letter that made her hands stop. To Isabeau, the girl who asked the wind where her brother went. He came here, a knight with broken armor and a full heart. I know he cannot say what he carries, but he carries you. She read it twice, then again. That evening, she walked into the garden where Alaric was harvesting mint. Quietly, respectfully, she knelt beside him. "I know you cannot speak," she whispered, "but I know now who you are." Alaric didn't flinch. He sat back, exhaled through his nose, and offered her a sprig of mint. She took it with a trembling smile. "You never told me goodbye, Alaric. Not after Khan. Not after them." A long pause. The cicadas were the only sound. Then Alaric picked up a pebble and pressed it into her hand. She opened her palm. Carved into the stone was a tiny cross, one he'd etched during his time in the chapel. His quiet way of saying, "I remembered," and Isabeau began to weep. Chapter 10. The Language of Rain. That night it rained. Not heavily, just a gentle soaking rain, like silk poured over the hills. It tapped against the monastery windows and pattered on the stone courtyard. The brothers, tucked in their cells, slept soundly to the rhythm. But Alaric sat in the chapel. Isabeau joined him, barefoot on the cool stone. The old wren perched in the rafters above them. Feathers puffed against the damp air. They didn't speak, but their silence was full, like the air between harp strings. She rested her head against the wall, watching him light the lantern near the altar. "You gave up speaking," she said softly, "but I wonder if it wasn't taken from you, by grief or shame." He didn't move. "I once asked myself," she continued, "if you lived, if you still held a sword, if you forgot the name of the child we buried." Alaric turned then, slowly, and from beneath his tunic he pulled a single dried rose, pressed flat as paper, still tinted with pink. He'd carried it all these years. It had been placed on the child's grave the day Alaric left. Isabeau reached out, tears trailing quietly. She did not ask for answers anymore. They both knew some truths did not need to be spoken. Chapter 11. The Lost Manuscript. The next morning, a storm had washed the air clean. Isabeau, preparing to leave, asked permission to copy one of Anselm's letters. While looking through a basket of loose parchments, she found something unexpected. Brittle, yellowing, half hidden beneath a piece of cloth. It was written in a different hand, one the ink labeled simply Alaricus, a confession, in writing. It told of Caen, the chaos, the betrayal, the fire, how Alaric had failed to protect his lord's children, how in a moment of terrible confusion his sword struck down a friend in mistake, how the silence he carried was not punishment, but penance. And yet it was written not in anguish, but peace, a peace slowly grown like moss over a broken wall. She left the letter with Father Benoit and asked only that it remain anonymous. "Let the silence have its own voice," she said. "Let the past be spoken without waking the pain." Chapter 12. The bell at dusk. Isabeau departed quietly. Alaric watched her ride away from the orchard path, the sound of her horse's hooves fading like ripples in a well. The wren returned to its usual post. The bell in the tower told dusk. Alaric stood beneath the twilight, hands at his sides, gaze on the horizon. That night he visited the chapel. He brought a new lantern, filled the basin with fresh water, and laid the dried rose at the base of the altar. He sat for a long while. Then, when the moon was high, he did something he hadn't done in a decade. He hummed, just a few notes. A lullaby, remembered from childhood, from a time before war. A melody like sleep itself, gentle, old, and unfinished. The mouse peeked from the stone crack. The cat yawned. The ivy curled inward, and the chapel seemed to sigh. Chapter 13. The Village Healer. Word spread quietly through the hills that the monastery had taken in a knight who did not speak. It was not the kind of gossip that breeds excitement. It was gentler, almost reverent, as if people whispered it to one another, like a lullaby passed down from grandmothers. A week after Isabeau departed, a village woman came to the gate. Her name was Celeste, and she was the healer of Broucourt, a hamlet some 5 miles west. Her hands were stained with lavender oil and ash, and her eyes were the color of clay. She wore a cloak frayed at the hem and carried a woven pouch full of dried herbs. "My son is sick," she said to Father Benoit. "No fever, no wound, but his spirit is gone." The brothers, though wise in scripture, were simple in medicine. Celeste had heard of the silent knight, a man who said nothing but heard everything. She didn't ask him to speak. She asked only that he come. That afternoon, Alaric mounted his old mare and followed her down the winding trail. Not as a knight returning to battle, but as a shadow moving with the wind. Chapter 14. The Child Who Would Not Wake. Brucour was a small place, little more than a cluster of thatched homes surrounded by low hills. The people greeted Alaric with wary kindness. Children peeked from behind barrels. A dog barked once, then wagged its tail. The boy was 6. His name was Emile. He lay curled on a pallet in the darkest part of the cottage, breathing, but still, eyes closed. No cries, no movement. He had not spoken in 2 days. Celeste knelt by him, placing a hand on the child's chest. "He saw something," she said softly. "A riderless horse, blood near the orchard. He's not sick. He's afraid." Alaric approached. He sat beside the child and removed his gloves. For a moment he simply breathed. Then, gently, he reached out and placed his hand over the boy's heart. His eyes closed. Not in prayer, not in power, in memory. He thought of a boy he'd once carried from a battlefield. Not Emile, another. A boy who had once laughed at frogs in the river and cried when he stepped on thorns. That boy had died, but Emile still breathed. Alaric reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, flat stone, the same kind he often carved for the chapel garden. This one had no cross, only a spiral, like a snail's shell or the curl of a fern. He placed it in Emile's palm. Within moments, the boy stirred. His fingers curled around the stone, and he whispered, "He heard me." Chapter 15. A Quiet Feast. The people of Brucour were not wealthy, but when Emile awoke fully the next morning, sitting up, smiling faintly, they gathered in gratitude. That evening, beneath paper lanterns strung between willow branches, they hosted a quiet feast. Bread baked with thyme, soft cheese wrapped in leaves, honey on fresh oatcakes. Wine poured sparingly from a single clay jug. They did not ask Alaric to speak. They honored his silence by offering their own, clinking cups softly, eating with slow joy, letting the crickets and owls fill the space between stories. Celeste sat beside him and asked only, "Do you wish to stay?" Alaric looked around. The stars were out, spinning their ancient wheel. A baby giggled in her mother's lap. Fireflies blinked near the well. And from a nearby cottage, a faint melody, a father playing a flute. He nodded once, and Celeste smiled. Chapter 16. The Sword Beneath the Oak. Alaric remained in Brucour through the harvest. He helped stack hay, mend fences, and build a new coop for the village hens. The people grew used to his silence. The children gave him nicknames: Old Owl, Mr. Stone, Knight Who Sleeps Standing. One morning, while clearing weeds near the great oak in the center of the square, his spade hit something. Metal, buried. He knelt, brushing aside soil. A sword, old, rusted, its hilt wrapped in crumbling leather. It bore no crest, only a simple carving near the crossguard, Per Pacem, through peace. The village elders said it had belonged to one of the forgotten soldiers who passed through during the wars, left there perhaps in guilt or sacrifice. Celeste watched as Alaric lifted the sword. He did not brandish it. He held it like one might hold a relic, gently, respectfully. Then he wrapped it in linen and placed it in the chapel by the field, beside the carved stones he kept there, not as a weapon, as a memory. Chapter 17. The Breath of Winter. When the first frost kissed the cabbages, Alaric stood on the ridge above the village and watched the white come. Snow in Normandy is not loud. It falls slowly, quietly, as if the sky is exhaling. The people of Bruchor lit fires, salted roads, and prepared for stillness. And Alaric found peace in the hush of winter, walking the trails with his old mare, carving stones for children who lost grandparents, helping fix broken shutters. He built a second chapel from timber and old tiles, not to worship, but to shelter those who needed quiet. Some nights, villagers would come and sit there, just to rest. Celeste joined him often. She never asked for stories. She knew the ones that mattered were told by the way he watched the clouds, the way he pressed herbs into hands, the way he smiled when someone found something they thought was lost. And in that quiet chapel, on the longest night of the year, she touched his shoulder and whispered, "You've given us more with your silence than many give in a lifetime of words." Chapter 18. The Smoke on the Ridge. It came first as a shadow on the eastern horizon. One morning near the feast of Saint Benedict, the shepherd boy Leon saw smoke curling beyond the tree line. Not a cottage fire, darker, heavier, like wet wool smoldering. By dusk, 3 more plumes rose. Celeste stood beside Alaric on the ridge. "It's not a storm," she murmured. They knew. Word would arrive soon, from hoof or horn or wind. By the next morning, a traveler came running from Écouché, wide-eyed, breathless. "Raiders," he gasped. "From the south, hired blades, burning the edge villages." Bruchor wasn't a prize. It had no garrison, no silver. But that made it more vulnerable, easy. The villagers gathered. Mothers clutched children. Old men held axes they hadn't touched in decades, and they looked to Alaric. He did not speak, but he stood taller than they'd ever seen him. And they understood. His silence had not made him passive. It had made him watchful. The chapel bell tolled 3 times, not in fear, in readiness. Chapter 19. The Return of the Sword. That evening, Alaric returned to the chapel where he'd placed the old sword beneath the altar. He knelt, not to pray, to remember. He unwrapped the linen, slowly. The metal still bore rust, but the edge remained true. He tested the balance. He felt the weight not in his hands, but in his chest. Memory, regret, resolve. Outside, snow fell gently. He did not don armor. He simply wore a padded cloak and wrapped his hands in boiled leather. He tied a cord around his wrist, Isabeau's old ribbon, faded green, and stepped into the night. By the well, the village men waited. They saw him approach with the sword in hand. No one cheered. No one cried. But every heart steadied. The silent night had returned. Chapter 20. The Firebreak. The raiders came just before dawn, moving like wolves between the trees. Alaric had studied their pattern, seen the smoke, counted the hours. He had chosen the field near the narrow pass where the stream ran thick. He met them not with shouts, but silence. The first man to charge saw only a still figure in the snow, then a flash. Steel curved through the mist. Alaric moved like water. He did not kill needlessly, only disarmed, diverted, drove them toward the stream where villagers had dug pits, loosened stones, prepared nets. It was not a battle. It was a breaking of fire, turning its path. The raiders, expecting slaughter, met something else. Resistance that was calm, coordinated, and unafraid. By sunrise, only 3 remained. They fled. Alaric stood in the clearing, blood staining his sleeve, breath steady. The snow continued to fall. The sword, once buried, now glinted in full morning light. Chapter 21. The morning after. No songs were sung. Bruchor was not a place for celebration. But that morning, the people opened their doors and walked the streets without fear. Children ran freely. The baker gave away 3 loaves without asking coin. Celeste wept, not from fear, but from the sheer relief of stillness. Alaric walked through the village. Wherever he passed, people touched his arm or bowed their heads. He paused at the well, where the oldest widow, Dame Léonie, sat wrapped in shawls. She looked up and said quietly, "You did not have to stay, but you did." He offered her a carved pebble, this one shaped like a leaf, and she nodded. "I know. You've been growing here, like a tree." Chapter 22. The Chapel of Stones. The snow melted slowly, and with it, some of Alaric's silence. He never spoke aloud, but he hummed often now, especially when carving. Children joined him in the chapel, watching him shape stones into birds, hands, stars. He showed them how to smooth the edges, how to polish with moss. One day, a boy asked him what his name was. Alaric picked up a stone, carved a single word: peace. "Is that your name?" the boy asked. Alaric smiled faintly. It didn't matter. Names change, wars fade. But peace, once planted, grows. Celeste stood at the chapel door, watching him with the children. She knew he would never leave now. Not because he couldn't, but because he had found something better than escape. He had found forgiveness. In the curve of a river, in the breath of winter, in the quiet presence of others. Chapter 23. The Letter with No Voice. Spring arrived with birdsong and thawing ground. One morning, Alaric sat by the chapel window, watching swallows return to the eaves. A child brought him a folded scrap of parchment. It was from Isabeau. It said only, "You were right to stay. I saw the fields. I saw what you've done. Thank you." He read it once, then again. And for the first time in years, Alaric reached for parchment himself. He wrote slowly, carefully, as if each word were a carving in wood. "I have no voice still, but I have peace. The sword is laid down. The children laugh. I build with my hands. I do not seek forgiveness anymore. I simply offer it. You were the first to see me. You reminded me I was not just what I carried, but what I chose to set down. A." He gave the letter to a passing monk bound for Lisieux, where he knew it would reach her. He sealed it with wax pressed into one of his carved stones, a circle with a tree inside. Chapter 24. The Festival of Forgotten Things. That summer, Brucourt held its first Festival of Forgotten Things. It was Celeste's idea. Thoughtful. "Too many festivals only celebrate crowns and saints," she said. "Let us celebrate what we've lost, so that it may be remembered and transformed." The villagers brought what they had: a boot with no pair, a wooden comb from a mother now gone, a torn pennant from an old war, a horseshoe found near the well. Each item was laid on the long wooden table in the square, and beside each Alaric placed a carved stone, not labeled, simply shaped: a spiral, a feather, a bell, a single star. That evening lanterns floated down the stream, each bearing the name of someone remembered. No grand eulogies, just soft names whispered into the night. Alaric watched the river carry them, and he knew, forgetting is not always loss. Sometimes it is how we make room for something new. Chapter 25. The Quiet Legacy. Years passed. Brucourt grew. The Chapel of Stones became a place where travelers rested, where children learned to carve, and where people came not to pray, but to be still. Alaric aged like a stone in the stream, slowly, gently, his edges softened by time. He never spoke, he never raised a sword again. But he taught many things: how to bind wounds, how to shape wood, how to wait for the rain. He taught boys who'd never known fathers how to be strong without being cruel. He taught girls who had only silence in their homes how to trust someone who truly listened. And when his hair turned white and his hands grew stiff, he chose a boy named Matteo to inherit the chapel. Thoughtful. "Teach peace like a story," he wrote once. "Let it be told in actions, not just words." When Alaric passed one cold morning, beneath the same oak where he'd once unearthed the sword, He left behind no grave with a name, just the chapel, and inside it a circle of carved stones, one for every soul he had touched. They called him the Silent Knight still, but everyone knew his life had spoken volumes. The end.